bows are better than guns. Or at least that's what fiction writers seem to think. Because despite the huge number of on-paper advantages of a firearm over a muscle-powered projectile weapon, we still see absolutely loads of archers running around in modern and even sci-fi settings. And not only do they match the people using guns, but they frequently outcompete them. So is this ever true? Are there any advantages to using something like this in a post-firearm world? In this video, I'm going to look a little bit into the history of bows, what made them successful, why they persisted so long, and also why they started to get replaced as technology progressed. And then I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to look at what happens if you take them into a modern, sci-fi, or even post-apocalyptic setting, and whether there's any reason for your characters to actually use them. P.S. In case you couldn't tell, the answer is yes. I love bows. I'm not going to do them dirty. And if taking fantasy tropes into a modern setting is your jam, then check out Everyday Heroes by Evil Genius Games, which you can purchase from the link below. It's a modern-day TTRPG with stats for everything from vehicle chases to computer hacking. And as the spiritual successor to D20 Modern, it's adapted from D&D's 5th edition. So if you already play, it should be fairly easy to pick up. I'm sure that'll buff out. The in-depth character creation system allows you to choose from and customize a whole host of builds. From stealthy hunters to wacky scientists. Oh, that's intense. To, I don't know, pole dancing content creators? Maybe with a background in LARP? Who use a combination of dancing and trick shots to distract their enemies and create openings for their friends. You know, just spitballing here. And with a whole host of adventure modules to choose from and a perfect score on drive-through, you know it's going to be good. So whether you prefer weapons like this, or like this, check out Everyday Heroes from the link below for the ultimate modern-day TTRPG. Now, I've got to get down from here. Just a quick disclaimer before we get too far into this. In case you couldn't tell by the Nerf gun, I am not a firearms guy. I'm an archer. I want to talk about archery and bows and the things that make them good. But because we're taking this into a modern and sci-fi setting, I have to talk a little bit about firearms as a comparison point. I'm not here to slag them off. If I miss something or make a mistake, please let me know politely. But I will do my very best to represent them as a benchmark rather than as a unique weapon in their own right, which they are, and lots of people will cover that if you want to learn more about them. Okay, quick history lesson. The earliest intact historical bows date to around 8000 BC and were found in Europe. But there are examples of arrowheads found in Africa that date to around 70,000 BC. So it's quite likely that these things have been in use for tens of thousands of years. They've arisen and been used on every inhabited continent barring Australia, and they have dominated projectile warfare for almost all of that time. And it's easy to see why. A bow takes the power that you have in your muscles and uses it to launch something faster and further than you ever could, making holes in things that you are nowhere near stabbing. In the right hands, they can be fast, accurate, and powerful. But they have some major downsides as well. They can be heavily affected by adverse weather conditions like wind and rain, and both they and their ammunition are bulky and awkward to carry lots of. But most importantly, they take a bloody long time to learn to use properly. And especially in Europe, as armour became increasingly advanced, the amount of power required for a bow to be able to keep up became increasingly obscene. And the time and effort required to train up on them got longer and longer until it was best measured in generations. Meanwhile, something like this was admittedly a lot slower to use, but more or less any idiot could pick one up and get reasonably good with it in a couple of months. And with the introduction of early handheld firearms, there were more and more alternatives, and the bow started to be relegated to only those cultures that had an embedded tradition of them. Which absolutely means that there were several points in history where a handful of skilled archers were the last of a dying breed in a world that was rapidly moving on without them. Which feels like a cool story trope. Fast forward a few hundred years to the European invasions of the Americas, and firearms technology had rendered the plate armour more or less useless, and so bows were once again quite a useful weapon for fighting them off. But the guns had progressed to the point where they had repeating technology, and were now outranging and outpacing the bow themselves. And in the time since then, the guns have only gotten better, while the bows have gotten mildly more efficient, but for the most part slower, as we focus more on target use rather than combat. So why do we see so many characters like Hawkeye and Katniss and Rambo still using bows in modern and future settings? First off, let's be honest, there's the rule of cool. Bows are distinctive and unusual and easily recognizable, so your character stands out from the gun-wielding goons that they're fighting. It's the same reason why in characters where everyone uses guns, the main characters tend to use something a bit more distinctive or visually obvious. But of course there's more to it than that, because in the intervening time since the Middle Ages, bows haven't necessarily gotten a lot easier to use, especially if you want to be able to compete with things like automatic rifles. So they identify your character not only as someone distinctive, but as someone with a hell of a lot of skill and confidence. For someone to be willing to take a bow to a gunfight, they have to be really, really good. And that's a great way of setting your character apart. And there's a long tradition of bows being used by storytellers as weapons for skilled underdogs, which probably goes back to the difference between bows and crossbows back in the day. Robin Hood was part of a band of merry men who were able to hold off basically an entire government force. And so Katniss and Hawkeye are part of a fairly grand tradition of archers defying the state and defying the odds to beat things they shouldn't be able to beat. But even in modern day, bows do have a significant number of genuine advantages. The first of which is their sound. Compared with even a silenced firearm, a bow just doesn't make very much noise, which makes them a useful tool, both for real-world hunters and for fictional characters who'd rather not give away their location. The second advantage is maintenance. This thing has a total of 2 parts to it. They're both easy to clean, and as long as I remember to wax the bowstring, it's nowhere near as vulnerable to weather conditions as its early predecessors. And this applies to ammunition as well. These arrows are relatively modern and fancy, but after I've shot them, I can just run up, grab them, and use them again. And a decent set of arrows will last me for months and months of shooting. So for a character in a setting or environment where they don't have easy access to resources, like say a zombie apocalypse scenario, or guerrilla warfare, or District 12, it makes absolute sense for them to use something like this that they can keep maintaining time and time again. For the same reason why in an apocalypse you'd probably be much better off with a bicycle than with a muscle car. And if everything does go wrong and the bow breaks, it's a lot easier to make a new one out of a bit of tree than it is to try and fashion a machine gun from scratch. Which leads to another point about availability. I can get hold of a bow relatively easily because I have insurance and everything kind of works. But if I wanted to get hold of a rifle, I would have to go through a whole certification process and do a load of training because they're not readily available here. So even someone in a post-apocalyptic Britain is going to very much struggle to come across guns and ammunition for them by just rummaging through British homes. And in that kind of scenario, you're really going to want something where you can reuse the ammunition and potentially even make more of it if you need to. Likewise for future settings with heavy restrictions on firearms and things like that, being able to fashion a homemade bow works quite nicely. And these are all tangible real-world benefits which you can see in a regular modern-day setting without too much stretch of the imagination. But what if we do want to stretch the imagination? What is the use of a bow in a sci-fi setting? Well, there is one in particular advantage that I can think of off the top of my head. Possibly 2. One of them is that bows simply rely on muscle power to draw and shoot. Using them in a low oxygen setting doesn't require any combustion, so that will work absolutely fine. And in magic settings where things like fire elements can be controlled or restricted by other magic users, they're still gonna work fine. But that's a bit of a niche scenario. And the main one that I want to talk about is the weight that these things can launch. Because if I get out my big boy bow, then I can shoot an arrow that weighs around 100 grams without too much of a problem. So if I want to launch different kinds of arrows for different niche purposes, such as knocking somebody out, or even delivering some kind of explosive payload, then I can do that with the same weapon that I'm using to make my regular shots, which opens up a whole bunch of opportunities for characters who use trick arrows or even magic arrows to achieve what they want. So, while in real life it's probably not a good idea to bring a bow to a gunfight, characters in fiction absolutely can, should, and will continue to use them in modern and future settings. Whether to show off their skill, for simple convenience, stealth purposes, or for something even sillier. Keep on enjoying them when they do.